My name is Temi Moore, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next section of today, and I'm so glad to have you here. As a community, we have waited anxiously for so long for therapies. And I think many of us had thought, rather naively probably, that once we had therapies coming through clinical trials and that they were successful, that they would easily be able to be accessible to our community. And what we've now realized is that is a much different situation and that the pathways to access are so much more complex. So last year at the Alliance meeting, we heard from Cystic Fibrosis Canada and the UK, and we learned from their experience of what it meant to be able to get therapies to their community. This year, we've collectively been working together to find solutions, and tomorrow you'll be hearing more about the work we have done as an alliance to begin looking at improving regulatory pathways on a global scale. So I look forward to chatting with you then about that. But for now, we are going to learn from SMA. So what do the worlds of spinal muscular atrophy and ALS-MND have in common? What can we learn from each other? We're going to hear about treatments, how genetics influence decision-making, and how treatment access is challenging at the local, national, and global levels. So now this morning, I would like to introduce you to Kenneth Hobby from Cure SMA, and Nicole Gousset and Kasper Wyczynski from SMA Europe. So Kenneth, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me this morning. I'll just get the screen sharing to check that that'll work.
You're getting close. There you are.
Does that look good?
It's great. Thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you. And again, thank you for inviting me in. It's always a privilege for me to be able to come in and tell the story of SMA, especially what's gone on in our community for the last 5 years, which has been just incredible to be part of. And so we have seen huge changes for our community, and very rapidly as well. Just really over the last 5 years, we've seen the disease change from what was completely untreatable. It was normally a fatal disease, where we were also waiting for very slow symptomatic diagnosis to take place. And now we got to a point, basically over the last 5 years, since 2017, where we have 3 treatments that are now approved. They are very powerful. All 3 of these treatments are disease modifying based on the genetic causes of SMA. In our community in the US, we actually have about 65% of all patients now that are on at least one of these treatments. So we've made some good progress as well on getting these treatments approved, but the access, the coverage, and the availability of these treatments as well. And also alongside this, we had to wait for that first treatment to be approved, but then we were able to make great progress with newborn screening. And even through the pandemic, actually, we moved very quickly, and we're close now to almost having that complete in the US. We're at 85% right now of all births in the US, which are getting screened for SMA, which is the first step to something which is really incredible, where we're then, with early diagnosis, we can have early treatment, we can get in before symptoms, before damage. And when we get these powerful disease modifying treatments in that early, before we've had damage in the motor neurons, we're really seeing amazing outcomes for those families and those patients. Hopefully a lot of you know about a little bit about SMA, and that it is very similar to ALS with what it looks like. What you see as the symptoms. It is a motor neuron disease. We have a genetic cause. There's differences from ALS to SMA though, where we have an SMA genetic cause, which is very homogeneous. Pretty much 95% of everybody that's going to get SMA has this same genetic cause around the world. We also have a genetic target in the body, which has been something which has enabled us to develop these powerful treatments. So it is a motor neuron disease, a genetic cause, but there's some similarities in then the symptoms, what happens after these motor neurons die off to ALS with the muscles, the atrophy, the weakness that's caused. So there's some crossover there. What we're seeing right now as well is some very interesting things as these treatments get approved and how SMA is changing around the world. We are seeing some great crossovers where the disease is the same around the world. The genetics is the same in SMA. These treatments work in the same way and they have the same impact, the powerful impact of these disease modifying therapies. What's that going to mean for patients around the world is going to be the same. So we're dealing with some kind of crossovers between countries, but then what we're also dealing with is the very different country specific approval steps, the regulatory steps, and then also the access, the payment. That's the part that's very different country by country. But at the same time, we are trying to remember that this disease, basically the cause of it, how the treatments work, what the outcomes are for patients is the same no matter where patients' families are around the world. One of the key things that we did in SMA was focus on a few areas when we were in the early research and clinical trial stages with an eye to getting approvals, but also what would happen after that with access to these treatments. We did try and focus very much on disease-modifying research, more than just symptomatic therapies. We tried to make sure that we were focused on the genetic targets and then targeted treatments to those genetic causes first and foremost. We also made sure when we were doing the clinical trials that we had very strong natural history to compare against, but also, and very importantly, where needed, which was in a lot of the clinical trials, having placebo controls, keeping the criteria for inclusion into these clinical trials very tightly maintained. And what that all did, combined together, was give us very strong clinical trial evidence. The results from our clinical trials were really powerful and conclusive. What that enabled us to do was get from the FDA very quick approvals and very broad approvals. This really strong data that came through from clinical trials really paid off with the FDA, where every single one of the treatments that have been approved so far has had a broader label than the clinical trial criteria. And in some cases, pretty much for everybody with SMA. These labels pretty much cover everybody that's going to be impacted with SMA, even if the trial criteria were in a specific type, a specific age group. So that was one first step that happened for us. We are now at this point, just quickly with our drug pipeline, where we have these 3 disease-modifying treatments approved. They all work in slightly different ways, but they are all disease-modifying, targeted to the genetics, the genetic causes, the genetic modulators of this disease. So they are very powerful. What we're working on now, and you can see in our pipeline here, is we have many other therapies that are in development. Some of these are the same kind of SMN genetic targeting approaches, but a lot of them now are starting to work in different ways, which are much more targeted to the symptoms now. Muscle directed is one kind of our first wave of new therapies coming through. And I'll get to this later on how we're now looking to build on the genetics to actually work on top of that with symptom muscle targeting in particular therapies that come through, and those will work in combination. So the story of access here in the US to these treatments, again, going back to 2017 when we had the first approval, is a steady increase. There's been an awful lot of effort to build up basically education and awareness of the disease with various groups. And that's the story of what we really focused on in getting access to the treatments, with education about the disease, understanding about how the treatments work and what their benefits are, but also making sure that that understanding is about what the impact of the disease is on patients and what patients are looking for from these treatments, what those benefits and outcomes are that are going to be important to patients. And making sure that education is being first with regulators to get the approvals, but then also patients, HCPs, payers. One thing that we've seen very in a really interesting way is the same information that we produce for approvals, we can then use for these later post-approval education and awareness stages. Again, patients, HCPs, and payers, that same information. And so it's been 4 or 5 years that we've been pushing that, and we've got up now to a point of about 60, 70%, right around 65% now. We're hoping 70% by year end, patients in the US on a treatment. We do see some differences in access to the treatments based on particular types and ages of the disease. We see very high access in newborn screening, pre-symptomatic younger groups, and up there for the newly diagnosed, it could be up around 90, 95%. As we get to older patients, we see lower levels of access. SMA is actually an interesting disease where it's kind of known as a pediatric disease. It was, and this is interesting to say, was the #1 genetic cause of death in infants. But actually the prevalence of our community, we have more people who are adults over 18 than under. And so we have a lot of adults. We're probably close more to around 50% of adults that are on treatment. About 50% are not. And so one of the things that's interesting there is a lot of that is actually just making sure that the adults themselves know about the treatments, are connected into the community, the SMA community, and also the HCP system. That's one of the first barriers to access that we have, and in some ways, probably the most important barrier to get over. Newborn screening has moved very quickly. It took a while. We had to get the first treatment, and then again, education, awareness with states, regulators. But once that took off and we got some of the big states in the US up and running, the last year or two, we really kind of moved that very quickly, even again through the pandemic. And so we're at about 85% now, should be 90% by year end in the US. And so that's one area that we're almost saying we're complete on. And then we're able to catch people at birth, before symptoms, before damage, before loss of those motor neurons, and getting the treatments in. And that is one of the key things, that the point isn't just diagnosis. That's important for certain aspects, but it's about early treatment. That's the ultimate point of that early newborn screening, diagnosis, getting access to treatment very quickly. And what we're seeing so far is that is working. And we're basically now going from what the situation was before, as I was saying, very slow symptomatic diagnosis. It used to take sometimes 6 months, several years, really bad symptoms and damage in the motor neuron area before diagnosis. Now we're going from birth, screening, and actually onto treatment, all within a month on average. And that's just amazing to be able to move that quickly, to have that system work. And then again, this is the area where we see incredible outcomes, where we're actually preventing the disease. That's the key part. We're preventing the motor neuron loss by getting these powerful treatments in that early. And so this is a great slide. What we're seeing is actually outcomes, a change in the community across the whole community now. This isn't just clinical trial data that we're seeing. We're seeing over time changes of how the disease is actually showing up. And we have other areas. This is kind of looking at the most severe form type of SMA called type 1, and really going since 2017 when we got those first treatments approved. This is showing, if you can see in the purple bar, the proportion of these type 1 patients who are sitting. And you can see that going very low, 10%, over 50% now. And what's spectacular about this is that is actually the very definition of what SMA type 1 isn't. SMA type 1 is patients that are never able to sit. And again, in the past, this was usually fatal. We're now at a point across our whole community where over half, over 50% of these type 1, what would have been type 1 patients, are now actually sitting. And this is through the treatments that are out there. But this is one of those outcomes that we're actually able to see and monitor. And we see this in other groups as well, with patients that never should have been able to walk and now walking. One of the interesting and very important things that we've seen are adults with SMA joining our community. And this is, again, it's surprising again, because SMA has always been known as this pediatric disease, but there's more adults with SMA who are out there and affected. But we've had to do an awful lot with the adults themselves, and then the healthcare system, hospitals, experts in the disease, a lot of education and awareness about SMA to all those people to get them engaged. And that's what we've done, getting these adults to actually join our community, which then we hope translates into joining the healthcare system, getting access after that to the treatments that we have now available. And we're rolling out now, we're building a network of care centers that are focused on SMA across the country. And this is important for us as we transition from where we were when we had maybe 10 to 15 hospitals, sites around the country in the US that were doing clinical trials, to now getting hospitals and sites that are ready to provide access to the treatments. And again, we've gone from maybe that 10 to 15 doing the clinical trials, experts in SMA, to where we have about probably 300 now in the US, hospitals that are delivering the treatments that we have available and becoming experts in SMA care as well. So that's been a huge growth area for us to focus on and bring in that many hospitals online up to speed about what SMA is, what the treatments are, what patients are looking for as well. And we've been building this clinical care network, which isn't going to serve everybody. We don't have the resources to be able to do that. But we want to build this network that does provide care, treatment, but also collects information, collects now real world evidence of what's going on with these treatments outside of just the clinical trials, which are very controlled, to now the experience of what happens when these treatments roll out in the real world. And we're collecting that information. We've got over 600 patients now in our network. And we're probably looking to get about 25% of all patients in the US into this clinical care network and registry for us as well. So going forward, we're still focused on access. We still have to pay attention to that area, but we are looking forward as well on what do we need to do with more research. We're not done. We do not have a cure yet for SMA, especially for our symptomatic older patients. but also what happens after the treatments. What's really important from all of these medical advances in the impact on families, but especially adults, individuals as they get older on their daily lives. That's in some ways, the very exciting part of what we get to focus on now. So we are still focused on access. We don't have everybody on a treatment yet. We don't have everybody that's even aware of the treatments that we have, even after this 5 years, and especially in this adult group. We think we're probably missing in the US somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 adults that are affected with SMA. We're not connected in to us as a community, as I was saying, to the HCPs that are focused on adults. They're not even aware and in the system to find out about the treatments that we have now available. So we have to work to reach those patients, along with a lot of advocacy and education on payers and hospitals. We use the clinical trial data, but over time now we're moving more to actually making sure that this real world evidence is coming into play as well. It's a busy slide here, but this is where we track every single policy that is out there for the 3 treatments that you see across the board here for SMA. And we're trying to match up the policies, the coverage that is out there to the FDA label. And it's kind of a heat map here where basically the red spots that you're seeing throughout this are where there is a restriction compared to what the FDA label was for the 3 treatments that were approved. And overall, we're pretty good. It's on the extremes of SMA where we see some of the restrictions coming in with the very severe patients that get onto permanent ventilation pretty much from birth to adult onset forms of the disease. That's where we have some restrictions, the policies that are out there, but it's almost close to probably 80 to 90% of patients in the community who have coverage, that the coverage is out there to provide them access to the treatments. I'll try and go quickly through some of these slides now, but we really are focused on what comes next for SMA, where we have these treatments that can work to slow the progression of the disease down. And in very good cases, when you have that newborn screening, pre-symptomatic diagnosis, prevent the disease from even showing up. But we are focused on the patients that have symptoms, who can get onto these treatments and stop further progression. But we need to do some work now to restore strength and function for the symptomatic patients in our community, which is often the older patients now impacted by the disease. So we're working to optimize the current treatments that we have, looking at different doses and things like that. And we're also building the infrastructure for clinical trials to be able to monitor clinical trials for older symptomatic patients, and sometimes that are working with being on one treatment already, adding a treatment on top of it. And so we are looking at therapeutic approaches which work beyond the genetics, which look, as I was saying at the start, more to the areas where you're seeing symptoms, and especially the muscles where we have the weakness. If we solve the genetics, which we think we're close to doing for a lot of patients, how do we work on the muscles to restore strength with new therapies on top of that? And a lot of this is trying to get away from the symptoms. We can do that with the genetic diagnosis, which gets us in before symptoms, before damage has happened. But we also want to focus now on what can we do to reverse those symptoms, especially in the muscle area, which we think is obviously, and I think a lot of you know this, easier than reversing the damage in the nerves. Those are a lot of the treatments that we're focused on now, reversing what we're seeing with the muscle weakness, building on top of the combination genetic therapies that we have as well. We do a lot of work in collaborations. I just got a few more slides now, but one of the key things that we do is we try to be a very welcoming community to outside groups. We're an orphan disease. We try to make sure that we're bringing in partners, whether it's researchers, industry groups, regulators, payers, the HCPs that are out there into our community to be part of our community. And we think that's been a key part of our success, that all these groups feel like they're part of the SMA success story. And so one of the other key things is building from the treatments, working in combination, the genetics, and then also symptomatic targeted therapies. Care is going to be just as important in terms of restoring function as well. It's really a combination of those 3 things we think are the real answer to getting a cure for SMA. And it is about building back that strength, and that's going to take physical therapy, nutrition, on top of muscle therapies, but on top of these very powerful genetic therapies as well. And again, one of the key things is making sure that we're collecting the evidence, the data that we need, the real world evidence to reduce the standards of care that are going to let us, and then the much broader network, these 300 hospitals that we have in the US, know what they have to do for SMA, the care side. And my last slide here is, again, just kind of coming back to what's really exciting from all of these developments, building from the research to the treatments that we have approved, is the impact that we're ultimately going to see on families, but especially the individual patients. What actually comes out from these increases in function strength eventually is allowing people to be more independent, to participate in their daily lives, whatever that is, in their families, education to start off with, and work. These treatments allow people to participate and be more independent in those activities. And we're starting to see that. And I think that's the really exciting part for us as we move forward now, to watch for those outcomes right at the end of this chain. So that is, I think, my last slide. Try and escape here. But thank you again for having me. It's always a privilege to be able to tell this story and to be able to show what we've done in SMA. But again, we're not done. We're very excited for what's going to come next. Thank you.
Welcome and good afternoon, everyone, to this presentation. I'm very much honored to be part of the International Symposium on ALS in 2021 and looking forward to explain to you some aspects on access to treatment and SMA Europe perspective. I'm Nicole, and I'm president of SMA Europe. So SMA Europe is a European umbrella organization that was founded 2006, and actually initially the organizations came together to commonly support a call for research proposals. Today we have 24 member organizations, and our vision is to create a better world for those affected by SMA. And our mission is that we are strive for earlier diagnosis, effective treatment, and optimal care for people living with SMA. And we want to do this by elevating the patient's voice, empowering our member organizations to advocate and campaign at the national level, and also by harnessing that network to eventually advance research and influence stakeholders at the European level. Here you see an overview of our SMA Europe member organizations. SMA Europe is organized in several operational segments. These are research, therapy and care, healthcare systems policy and access. And our foundation is actually capacity building, internal organization, internal capacity building, but also capacity building in terms of strengthen our member and individuals advocate to be more effective. And eventually our roof is communication and outreach. So we really want to make sure that SMA Europe's voice for SMA patients eventually is heard, but also relies on evidence-based patient advocacy. This session here is about access to treatment and also to showcase you what we have done in our SMA field. And I made some thinking, and in the end it's clear it's not a single initiative that leads to success or improvement, but usually it's a whole portfolio of activities that can then lead to hopefully a better situation. So for SMA Europe, I present 3 access advocacy tools. First, it's our patient experience survey, the UPESMA, then an SMA daily life study, and a huge project that we initiated recently, our Audisma project. That's an SMA Europe Access Atlas. First, to our most original advocacy tool, the European Patient Expectation Survey. We had launched a survey already back in 2016-17 and had another survey launched in 2019, which was more extensive than our first one. And here, actually, we were targeting all SMA patients across Europe and translated the survey into 16 languages, had 44 questions on different topics, and eventually this work led to a scientific publication and also a lay summary that we could feed back to the participants. The results of this survey are all patient reported and reflect the perception of patients. So what we found in this survey is, for example, that stabilization of the current clinical state is considered as a progress by SMA patients. 96.7% of the participants agreed to this statement. And this is a very, very important statement, also in regard to advocacy for access to treatment. Then we also delivered some data that fatigue, pain, and psychological problems really indeed affect the perceived quality of life of SMA patients. This was already before we did the survey quite clear to us, but it's as the field as our field is quite heavily relying on data, on evidence, it's always good to also back up even things that are very clear to you with data. So that's what we did here. And then we also found, based on this survey, that many patients who actually wanted treatment do not have access to treatment. As I already said, to really add impact to this survey, we wanted to publish it in a peer-reviewed scientific journal so that it could also be used not only for patient advocates, but also could be used and cited by other stakeholders. And also very important, we did a thank you lay summary for all our participants, just to also increase confidence in case we would want to repeat such a survey at a later stage. So it's really that this European Patient Expectation Survey was the seed for new initiatives. So we found that stabilization is important. We found that fatigue, pain, psychological problems are important. And we knew that the assessments tool used were probably not the ones that would capture those factors. And also, as I already mentioned, we found that many patients who actually wanted treatment do not have access to treatment. But we, as patient advocates, want equal access for all who can benefit from a treatment. So access to treatment was a second topic that we identified that which we should investigate more. But coming back to the first set of identified gaps. So basically, our survey also showed that individuals are more than only their motor skills. Traditionally, outcomes in SMA are measured in motor scales, and here we could clearly show that there is more than only motor skills when it comes to value of treatments, or which kind of value treatments can have. But still, we also realized that assessment tools do not really capture those patient-relevant changes, or that there's still quite some open gaps to address this. So this remains a challenge. We then decided to start an SMA daily life study. And this is actually a longitudinal study that we are doing in collaboration with Tilburg University to identify important indicators of well-being in SMA. And the study design is fully driven by patient expert and the patient advisory committee. And the idea is that we are focusing in this study more on the chronic population in SMA, and will follow them for several months in their lives. This study is a collaboration also with Cure SMA for certain aspects, such as physiotherapy, nutrition, and treatment expectations. So we will also look into how these aspects are interlinked and impacting each other, and how these factors are also linked to well-being, and if some of these factors could also be indicators of well-being. So this project will be running from 2021 to 2023. The second set of gaps we identified is obviously access to treatments. So we knew that many patients who wanted treatment do not have access, and we also know that access across different countries is extremely variable. But we also are very well aware that patient advocacy organization can make a huge difference in improving access. Not saying that's all on their shoulders, but we realize that well-prepared patient advocates can impact the situation nationally. So how can we make sure that our member organizations and also individual patient advocates in the SMA field are prepared to advocate for access in their countries? So SMA Europe has many different initiatives ongoing that are all linked to access to treatment. So we had trainings, we have different outputs of alliances and projects. We have our surveys, we have internal surveys, but we were missing the link, or the link that brings all of that together. And here actually comes into play the Audisma. It's our SMA Europe Access Atlas. So what is Audisma, or what is it about? So really, Audisma in the end should be a tool that supports access to treatment and care that was very important for us. So it's access to medicines and care in general for all individuals living with SMA across Europe. And it's a tool to gather evidence, knowledge across Europe to understand the local or national situation. We can map access to medicines and care. We can analyze differences between countries, between also subgroups of the disease, and identify gaps and challenges. And we can also develop, and that's quite important, coaching programs for our members. And then even together with members, identify national access strategies. And hopefully we can also harmonize access to medicines and care across Europe with time. So the objectives of this project initiatives are actually very well aligned with our internal access strategy. So it's really about evidence generation, identification of data gaps and fill these, information and coaching for our members, but also partnership with the stakeholders. So the Audesma should, in the end, is an online portal that will map and visually display the situation on access in different European countries. It will help us to understand the differences across countries, but also across patient subgroups, and will help us to identify our access priorities. So it's very important to us that no one is left behind. The tool is also important so that we and our members can gain the needed access skills and really build this access strategy on a national level. And it's also very important that we can use this tool in the end also to inform about evidence generation priorities. So we will have all this data in one place and we will map it and we will see the gaps where we need more evidence generation and can then also targeted reach out to our stakeholders to ask for potential projects to fill these gaps. So perhaps some of you have heard of the Biogen Policy and Access Tracker. This was actually a first step towards our Audesma project. So we initiated a year ago a collaboration with Biogen, between Biogen and SMA Europe, to establish this policy and access tracker, and the results should be disseminated in form of a website that's already interactive and has the results of this work displayed. And also we decided to write a white paper on the topic of access to treatment and care. So this was really a very important first step to then also launch our large project Audesma that will capture then also additional topics in this field. So more specifically, I would like to invite you to go to the tracker website and play around a bit and see all the information that's collected there. So we collected information on political leadership and policy, on healthcare system preparedness, on diagnosis, on access pathways, but also on access to treatment and care. So I think it's already a wide variety of information that's in this tool, but you will also see that there is, of course, still gaps when it comes to the indicators, and that it's not yet the full picture. And also in some of the indicators, we might need to deep dive a bit more to really unravel the gaps, and also to really unravel potential factors that will impact our tactics, national advocacy tactics. So as I already said, this was the first step to our more comprehensive project within SMA Europe that will have its initial phase from 2021 to 2023. But of course, this will be an ongoing initiative of SMA Europe, because the data that's on the platform needs, of course, continuous curation, and it has to be accurate to be meaningful. So we are fully aware that this is a huge project, and it's also a long-term initiative of SMA Europe. Perhaps when I was talking, you thought, okay, what, why Audisma? And actually, I really want to close my presentation here by explaining you why Audisma, why this name. So it's actually very simple, because SMA treatment and care pathways are across Europe. They are very long. They are very burdensome in many cases, and certainly also eventful. Not always for the pleasure of the patient, but they are sometimes quite eventful. So actually, SMA Europe decided to merge Odyssey, in reference to Homer's Odyssey, who was on his long eventful journey, with SMA. And so we came up with the name Audisma. And I really hope I could provide to you some insights into our work in SMA Europe, and also to show you that we are working to really to respect also the complexity of the topic. And I think there is not one initiative that solves it all. It needs different initiatives, but still we also need to consider that in the end we are a patient organization. Many of us are volunteer workers, and so we need also to prioritize and to balance investment with outcome. I thank you really very much for your attention, and I hope you will have a very interesting discussion just after my presentation. And I would very much thank Kasper Ruczynski, who is taking my place here in the panel, and I'm very confident that he can give you very interesting insights when it comes to access to treatment in SMA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole and Kenneth, and thank you for joining us this morning, Casper, to be able to answer some questions. It's definitely evident how much further ahead SMA is and what we can learn from your organizations and from your experience. So I appreciate it. So I'd just like to remind everybody that please put your chats, your questions into the Q&A, and we will be answering them. But we do have a couple that have come in already. So I guess asking to each of you, maybe if you could look back, and I know this is a very simplistic question, but look back, maybe even 5 years, and say, what is there, or if anything, that you would have done differently? And maybe we can learn from some of those lessons learned that SMA has had. Casper, do you want to take that one first, or Kenneth?
All right, let me take it first. First, thank you for an opportunity to participate in this fantastic meeting. So I'll share from our perspective at SMA Europe what we would have done differently. Sorry. Well, first of all, we would try to play a bigger role in clinical trial design, especially to ensure that the data that's generated in clinical trials is concerns as wide population as possible. As we know, drugs for rare diseases are developed initially by smaller pharma companies, by small biotechs. They do not really think about a later reimbursement or market access. They try to develop a product and sell it to a bigger company. But the data generated at this early stage impacts the scope of approval in Europe at least, but in many legislations. And the scope of approval and the existing data later on translate directly into the scope of reimbursement. So we see with the first treatment for SMA with nusinersen, there was no data generated for adults, and as a consequence, a number of countries in Europe do not provide this drug for adults, simply because there was no data. So had we known that, we would have perhaps engaged more with the first treatment. We learned this lesson and we tried to, we took part in designing later clinical trials of a different treatment, a risdiplam, that's just came to the market this year in Europe. And we see the challenges are much smaller. The second thing that we've done differently, we would perhaps at least tried to engage more in the ongoing efforts to harmonize healthcare across Europe. Currently, the situation is that, we did not have experience with rare disease treatments. We did not expect that access to therapies will differ so much between countries. The situation, and we faced a situation when a child was born simply on the wrong side of a border that does not exist because people can move freely across the continent. They don't really see that you can move, you can relocate, you can start work wherever you want. And then it turned out that the wrong side of the border, and a child will live or a child will die. So even now, 4.5 years from the approval of the first treatment for SMA, we see countries where children are not treated, even children are not treated, adults are not treated I would say in around 8 countries in Europe, children are not treated. And this, surprisingly, these are countries with a very high income. So these are high income countries. So harmonizing healthcare is the second thing that we have done. 3, and this is sort of links to that non-harmonized access, differences in access. That price of treatments. No, we never thought, never in our wildest dreams, in our worst nightmares, that the treatments that us as the community have to develop, and especially CANYAT and Cure SMA did a fantastic job in funding early research into treatments. Same for SMA Foundation, and us at SMA Europe, we also do fund the treatments, and we contributed to the development of some therapies. But we never thought that a treatment for SMA will cost over $250,000 per patient per year. And that's over the lifetime. It has to be taken for the lifetime of patients. That another treatment, a single injection, will cost over $2 million, right? So we did not expect that, frankly. So this was a challenge, and had we known that, we would have approached it perhaps. 3, we did not fully, we understood that, but we did not act much on the fact the differences in the clinical standard of care have on the data generated in clinical trials and on the measured efficacy of treatments. The differences in the care do exist. They are huge in such a diverse continent as Europe, with diverse healthcare systems. We only thought that they matter for patients, but we did not really do much to somehow measure the impact on the, or somehow account the impact in the data generated in clinical trials, and later in access and measuring the efficacy of treatment. And then the efficacy, as an example, poor respiratory care can lead to a death of a child, even a child who receives treatments. So if there is poor quality of respiratory care in a country, then children will be dying and the treatment will not be deemed effective, because still children are dying. It's not preventing death, or at least not as much as it was hoped. So Nicole mentioned a project, the ODISMA project, as a first step to understand the differences in clinical care across our continent. We hope it will it will lead to improvements. We are also funding now, organizing a scientific congress that takes place every 2 years, that aims to bring in clinicians and researchers from across the continent and beyond to kind of share the experiences. These 3 points, I think I would say that we would have done differently.
Thank you very much, Casper. That you've hit on a lot of things that I think we see within the ALS space, and already as we're seeing therapies come forward, that clinical trial design up front has become a limitation for what patients can get access later on. So that's an interesting thing to learn about. And I had to smile while you were talking about harmonizing healthcare across Europe. And I kind of thought, oh my goodness, but then the reality is that even across Canada, we see that where people have very different access depending upon the province that they live in. So you've hit on a lot of different aspects. And Kenneth, maybe could you bring anything else that you've seen from the US perspective that you would suggest we should be considering and kind of have that forward look on?
Probably the biggest item for us throughout the whole access kind of pathway timeline that we've been on was the HCPs, the healthcare professionals and the hospitals. That was the biggest area that we had to focus education and awareness on, even more than the payers. It was getting the medical systems ready to deliver these treatments in the real world. I think I said it in my presentation, but we had to go from just a few 10, 15 hospitals that were doing the clinical trials to having over 300 now. And so that expansion, that was really in the US, the bottleneck, the biggest bottleneck on access for treatments. And I think anything that we could have done there ahead of the game, a little bit in advance of getting the approvals, would have helped. But it was difficult. Looking back, we would have liked to have done that, maybe 6 months, a year ahead of the approval. But at the same time, there is that difficulty of how do you get the attention of people? Hospitals, HCPs who are busy anyway, it's tough to get their attention until you have a treatment to do something about a disease. But trying to find some pathway to get in a little earlier in that stage probably would have provided quicker access to some patients.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is that, SMA is among the first neuromuscular disorders where causative treatment has come to market. So maybe can you identify challenges faced with systematic access to these therapies for patients, especially outside of the US? And Kenneth, maybe do you want to take this one? Or pardon me, Casper, actually, sorry.
Yeah, so outside of the US, it's maybe let me mention that in Europe, we receive queries from other continents too. My Spanish colleagues work closely with a patient organization from South America, from Latin America. Myself, I frequently liaise with organizations from Asia and North Africa. They also work together with my French colleagues. So we sort of see I wouldn't say global, but quite a wide picture as regarding access to treatments. The challenge in most countries is the price. And I think it's the challenge is the price and the fact that many pharma companies do not really think of selling the drug to developing countries. They do not create a plan even to market it, and they do not appreciate, they do not understand how desperate patients are to get access to treat the child, to save the life of the child, because SMA, SMA kills. SMA is a disease that without a treatment, 60–70% of children will die within the first years of life. That was extremely frustrating to receive queries, desperate queries, dramatic emails from families just outside of Europe or in very poor European countries in the Balkans, for example. And they had no way, and the pharma companies were not really prepared to sell the drug there. Right now, I estimate that around US and Europe and America included, like around 20% of children in the world, patients, children in the world are getting treatment. 80% are excluded, children with SMA. So, and there are no plans to do that. There are companies are negotiating with governments for years and years. And it's something that has to be resolved more on like a global scale and not on the national scale, but that has to do with like pricing of pharmaceuticals, the huge differences between the US market, the European market, which is generally cheaper, sometimes significantly cheaper, and then all the developing countries where families are left without treatment. Frankly, I mean, when I'm seeing like families in Turkey or families in Iran trying to crowdfund $2 million for the treatment, families in Iraq, in Syria, right now I had a family from Jordan trying to collect, because the child was like diagnosed at 2 weeks of age, and they had just a couple of weeks to save the child. Later on, there will be very little to save, and that's very dramatic. So that's a challenge, I would say, which us as patient organizations can help to resolve, but only to an extent. We would need to engage with decision makers, with the stakeholders, with decision makers, with healthcare regulators, with the international organizations, and that's a challenge ahead of us, as I can see.
Thank you, Casper. It sounds like we're heading on the right track with the work that we're doing on trying to find even international collaboration on regulatory approvals, but then we still maintain the issue of access when it comes to reimbursement. Kenneth, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that question?
So it's interesting what we're seeing. It definitely is. Other countries around the world happen after the US. We see that the approvals, the access comes after often, and I think it's played out with all three of the treatments here after things have happened in the US. I see some hopeful signs though. There definitely seems like the countries, while they might be after the US and getting going, sometimes move very quickly through some of the steps that it's taken us longer to do in the US. And so it's interesting that they might come after, but they can actually move more quickly for some of the access approvals, the newborn screening. And I think what we're trying to work on is sharing some of the information and the learnings that we get in certain countries. We do it from the US. So we're seeing what is it that we can share from the learnings in the US with other countries. And I think, again, there's certainly country by country is very different, the approvals and the access. But again, the information on how the treatments benefit patients is going to be the same around the world. And so when we can show in the US what the impact is, what the outcomes are, what is it that these treatments enable patients to do, we are actually looking to share that as much as we can with these other countries for them to use in their approval and coverage discussions. And I think that's something that we hope is going to play out. And when we're seeing success in the US, when newborn screening gets implemented, when access is there, and you see the changes that I showed on that one slide, changing the lives of patients so dramatically, that information can be used in other countries to encourage them to move as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank both of you for your presentations today. It sounds like we've got a great follow-up session that we could do, and that's around what after. And I know that, you know, even as we were doing our strategic planning, we considered what would life be with when ALS becomes treatable, not terminal. And we learned from other diseases as well through that process. And even I think sometimes we can some of our wording can get us caught into a place where we're saying, cure SMA. If people think it's cured because you've got one therapy, therefore they kind of move on. And so how do we make sure it stays front and center and then takes into account what are those issues going to be when people are living longer with a disease like SMA or like ALS. So we'll be sharing, keep your numbers on speed dial so that we will be able to call you for next year and the year thereafter so that we can continue to learn. But thank you to both of you for being here with us today. It's been an excellent session and I'm sure very informative for our members. So we're very appreciative.